Hello and welcome. Alright, so I've been seeing a lot of discussion in my comments and on social media lately about where to get your rats from, basically. And I've done a video similar to this before where I said the places you could get rats from. And, well, since it's just been coming up a lot again lately, I thought I would do it again, but spicier this time. Because I have a lot of opinions. And they're gonna come out. So yeah, just as a disclaimer, I'm not going to judge you for where you get your rats from. I'm going to judge you on how you take care of your rats. Also, yeah, I'm going to be a little bit salty at some points because that's just kind of who I am as a person. So I do apologize for that. And yes, my cat is in fact here. Anyway, let's get started. So we're going to start with the big one, which is pet stores. And the thing with pet stores, you're going to hear a lot of times people say that you shouldn't get your rats from pet stores or honestly any animal from a pet store. And there's debate, obviously. I've gotten a lot of rats from pet stores. My first 16 rats were from a pet store. And honestly, it's something I do regret doing. I don't regret the rats themselves. I just regret where I got them from. So the issue with pet stores, the main issue is where they source their animals from, which is breeding farms. So basically any rodent you get from a pet store is going to be bred at a rodent mill. So basically what that means is that they're going to be kept in the smallest enclosure possible, sometimes no bigger than a shoebox. And the females are going to be bred back to back to back with very little to no interest in their health, genetic health, and their offspring and socialization, or in their overall care. And that leads to issues, genetic issues, like heart failure, hormonal aggression, tumors, shy rats, like bitey rats, all this stuff can be traced, at least in some part, to genetics. Some of it's socialization, some of it's genetic. That's just how animals are. And then the other issue is, in fact, what happens to these animals in the rodent mills, which is that they're just bred over and over and over again until they pass away or can no longer breed, in which case they are typically disposed of in the quickest fashion you can imagine. And these animals just aren't treated like animals, are treated like products. So when you go to a pet store and you see a cute rat in the cage, or you're sad because they don't have proper care and you take that rat home, you may be helping that particular rat get out of a bad situation, but you're ignoring everything that's happening with the rats that came before them. So if you save one rat, you're not thinking about his mother or his sisters that are still there or any of that stuff. You're just thinking about that one rat. And those rats do need homes. I will say this every single time. The rats themselves are not the problem. The rats that you can get from a pet store can be sweet. And a lot of people say that pet store rats will just be worse temperament-wise than breeder rats. And that's not the case. The rats themselves can have a bad temperament, they can have a good temperament. They're in general a lot more unpredictable than rats that have been deliberately bred. But to say that that breeder rats are very predictable and will always be a certain way is extremely untrue. And it's unfair to pet store rats and rescue rats to say that they're going to have a bad temperament just because of where they come from. And I will get to that again further in the video. A couple of other problems with pet store rats is that it encourages people to impulse buy, because pet stores will claim they have everything you need to get started, which they don't. Especially with rats. Rats tend to be wholly under considered in the market. So you'll go to a pet store, you can get stuff for parrots, and some hamster supplies will work for rats, that kind of thing, but they're not going to have products dedicated to rats other than rat food. And a lot of the stuff that they do have just isn't good for any animal, but they'll try to push on you anyway. And then there's the factor of the cages. So pet stores will tend to have cages that are much smaller because they can fit more on the shelf, which in their brains is more products sold. And then people get these small cages, they put their rats in them, and then they wonder why the cage smells, why their rats are always stressed and biting and trying to escape. It's the same with hamsters. Like, people get hamsters and they put them in really tiny enclosures, and then they wonder why their hamsters have bad behavior. And to be quite frank, some of that is also genetic because of the rodent mills. Another issue with pet stores is their tendency to missex animals. So the thing is, they don't care. They don't care. Back when I was getting pet store rats, there was this one time I went into a Petco because I was looking for rats, and I went back to their section with the rats in it. They had both male and female rats, supposed to be separated, and I looked into the tank, and they had just several males and several females hanging out together in the same tank because they weren't paying attention and they didn't care. The rodent mills also don't care, so sometimes they'll just throw in the wrong gender with the others and just expect it to be fine because they don't care. It doesn't matter to them if someone's pregnant. It doesn't matter to them if someone ends up putting a male in with like multiple females not knowing any better. It doesn't matter to them. And then I remember later that day my friend called them because we pointed out that the two sexes were mixed. And my friend called them, Cappy. She called them later that day, and she asked them if they had female rats, and they said yes. And then she asked, so are you the one that had them mixed together? And the person paused because she wasn't expecting that question. And she's like, well, yes. And Cappy's like, so you didn't fix that? And the woman was like, well, I mean, you know, she didn't have anything to say because she didn't fix it. That's what pet stores do. And then furthermore, you are more likely to get sick or injured rats. So when you put a bunch of animals in these small tanks, they do tend to fight. I've been in a pet store and I've seen 2 guinea pigs fighting. I've been in a pet store and I've seen, they had one of those giant like garden troughs, one of those metal bins, and it was just full to the brim with chicks basically. They could barely move. There was just no room for them to move around each other. And the chicks were pecking at each other, and there were several not alive chicks in the bin because the store didn't care. They just filled it as full as it could go and walked away. So this kind of thing leads to fights. You're more likely to get an injured animal. You're more likely to get a sick animal. 2 of my pet store rats died as babies. One was 5 weeks old. One was 7 or 8 weeks old. One of them clearly had heart failure, and the other one, I don't know what happened. I just came home one day and she was gone. There was something always off about her. But to this day, I still do not know what was off about her. She just seemed off to me. And one day I came home and she was gone. That is very common with pet store rats. And I know you may think, oh, well, if they're sick, then I definitely want to get them. And I'm not going to fault you if you get a sick animal from a pet store because you want to help them. Like, I understand that logic perfectly. I would also find it very hard to walk away from a sick animal. In fact, I probably wouldn't. But the thing is, it's just more common with pet stores. And as you purchase these animals, you're telling the pet store and the company that you're getting them from that you want this to keep going. You are basically endorsing them having these animals. So they continue to overbreed the moms until they are useless to them. They continue to put out poorly bred rats into these stores that are sick, and they continue to have those rats pass on to other people. And if you stop buying them and they stop making money off them, they will stop carrying them. And that is why people say to not get pet store rats. It's the bigger picture. And the thing with that is, obviously you don't want the rats to suffer, but also think about like the people who don't know better. So think about like a little kid that's parents decide to get them a rat. A, you don't want that little kid to have a rat. And B, you don't want that little kid to come home from school a week later and find their rat passed away in the cage. It's just a horrible situation. So again, I'm not going to fault you for getting pet store rats, but these are the reasons that people give. These are the arguments that people give. I personally will not get a rat from a pet store. I don't go into pet stores that sell rats, so that I'm not even going to see them in distress, because it will just upset me and I can't bring them home. Not only for that, but because if I bring home a sick rat, it could easily spread to every single rat I have in my house. Because pet stores are very unmonitored in that situation. Anyone can bring their dog into a pet store. Anyone can bring any kind of disease into a pet store. And if it gets into the rat colony that's in the pet store, it will get into your existing rat colony, and it could wipe them all out if you do not take proper quarantine measures, which can be very difficult because they're still in your house. Even if you have them in a separate airspace, they're in your house, and therefore contamination is possible, especially because you don't always know. So yeah, that's the thing with pet stores. So next we're going to talk about feeder breeders and feeder bins. So I'm keeping feeder bins separate from pet stores because I think Petco still sells their rats as feeders, but feeder bins are a very different thing from the like chain pet store rats. They come from the same place as far as I know, still rodent mills. Some stores will breed their own stock, and obviously feeder breeders breed their own stock. The difference being feeder bins are in stores. Feeder breeders are private reptile collectors who breed their own food, basically. And when they get an overstock of rats, they then sell them off. Typically, they don't really care who they sell them off to, so you'll see a lot of times they're just like, they're handled daily, which they aren't. They are not handled daily. They are lying to you. But yeah, that's typically what you'll see. So this is more of a gray area in my opinion, because I do not think these do not exist for the pet rodent trade. They exist for the reptile pet trade, meaning they don't care about us owners. As long as there are snakes who are eating live, which in America it is legal to live feed your snakes, as long as that exists, then live feeder bins will exist. Which is what makes it a gray area in my mind, because I don't think us as pet owners can stop it from happening by not purchasing these animals. And it's a lot harder to say that you aren't saving them, because you technically aren't saving them. You're not rescuing them, you are purchasing them. But you are saving them from being food. Do I think you should purchase feeder bin or feeder breeder rats? No. The reasons why are similar to the pet store. If you're getting them from some small privately owned shop, they are still probably getting them from rodent mills, and we don't want rodent mills to exist. If they are privately breeding them, then they are definitely not taking the care to carefully select which females and males go together. They're probably breeding them in a back room of their shop in a rack system with very little to no actual care toward the animals. And it's going to be the same thing of overbreeding the mom continuously until she can no longer produce, and then disposing of her in the quickest way possible. The other factor is also that they're still going to be sick, maybe even more so than pet stores, because pet stores you might get an employee that cares because they're supposed to be a pet, but these specialty stores where they're just food, they're not going to care. They're just going to remove them from the drawer if they're sick, probably put them in a bin in the back room, and just let what happens happen. And that's awful, I know, but chances are if you do bring home a sick one, they're not going to live very long. And they're still going to have all the same genetic issues. They're still going to have behavioral issues that have been bred into them, genetically speaking. They're still going to have all the issues that pet store rats have. They are, in fact, more likely to come to you missexed or pregnant, because the employees haven't been taught to care about that. They haven't been really taught to check. And it's just all around not a great thing. And I've had feeder bin rats. All of my Petco rats are technically feeder bin rats. And then I had Humdrum, Merit, and Mercy, whose mom was a feeder breeder rat. And then she ended up with my friend Kendra. She was pregnant. I took home the 3 babies, which would have ended up as snake food. And they were amazing rats. I'm not gonna lie, they're good rats. However, they are not the guarantee. They are the exception. I have friends who've gotten feeder bin rats. Most of them passed away before they were a year old. A lot of them ended up with so many kinds of issues, like respiratory problems. One of them ended up, like, I'm not entirely sure what happened, but she was 10 weeks old or something, and she started bleeding profusely from her vagina, and she ended up needing an emergency spay. Another one was pregnant. Like, these are just, feeder bin rats just have a whole host of problems, and you don't want to contribute to their breeding, basically. And it is more of a gray area, because those rats are going to end up in a snake tank. Rescues I follow, I can't tell you how many times they get a pregnant female that gave birth in a snake tank, and the owner didn't know what to do because all of a sudden there's 12 rats when they only wanted the one for like very little time. It happens, it's unfortunate, and you don't want it to happen with you. Most people aren't equipped to suddenly go from having 1 or 2 rats to having 14 rats. It's a lot to deal with. So yeah, that's kind of the deal with those two. Again, more of a gray area. I still say stay away from it, because it's more for you. You're going to burn out quickly if you get these types of rats, because it's hard. Owning rats is hard. It's not always a fun experience, and like, the benefit is that you get the rat and you get whatever time with them that you can. And getting feeder bin, feeder breeder rats, you're not guaranteed to get even a full year. All right, next let's talk about rescues. Now, typically, if someone asks me where they should get their first rats from, I do say a reputable rescue because of how breeders in the US are, which I'll get to in a bit. So, for a rescue, you want to find a 501c3 organization. That just means that they are legally a rescue. That does not mean they are a reputable rescue. It's a good start. And a reputable rescue is usually pretty easy to spot because they'll show their rats. They won't be asking exorbitant prices for their rats. They'll explain why their adoption fee is what it is. They'll often give medical advice, care advice, that kind of stuff on their pages. They'll have some kind of website, a dedicated Facebook page. You'll see the rats that they intake. You'll see the rats that they adopt out. It'll be very clear how they're run from the page. A lot of them will have outdated info, which is unfortunate, but in a rescue situation, at the very least, they're still trying to help. But it'll be usually very clear. You don't want to find a rescue via like Craigslist or even a rehoming page because those are oftentimes a scam. You want to find them you want to look them up for your local area, or sometimes on rehoming pages, they'll have them listed in the comments, the kinds of rescues that are near you. That's how you want to find a reputable rescue. And so the thing with rescues, the like mildly hypocritical thing, and I'll point it out, it is hypocritical. A lot of those rats are going to be pet store rats and feeder bin rats or backyard breeder rats. So all the things health-wise and behavior-wise that I mentioned before could be true of these rats. They are not as predictable. However, the rescue knows this, which is one of the reasons I typically tell people to go to rescues. The other being until someone has a full understanding of what the breeding situation in the US is like and the red flags to look for, what questions to ask, that kind of thing. It's just a safer bet to ask a rescue what kind of rat works for a beginner because they will know. They'll do assessments, they'll do health checks, they'll rehabilitate the rats that need to be rehabilitated, they'll place them in fosters to learn how to trust people. They'll be very upfront with what the rats are like because they don't want the rats returned. It's going to happen, inevitably. Rescues get burnt out very quickly from this sort of thing, especially because of how pet stores treat their rats and the pet industry and all this stuff. Like, both the rescues near me are currently closed because they just need a break because it's draining work. It is very draining work to rescue rats. But they're ultimately there to help. They'll even help you get started. They'll tell you what cages to look for. They might have some used cages for sale. That pops up a lot. They'll be there to help you because, again, they're there for the rats. Even the ones that have slightly outdated info, they can still help you get started. You just have to do your own independent research. So the thing with the rescue rats is it's really hard to say how long they'll live. So I have Ducky, who is a rescue, and she's 2 years and almost 11 months old. And then I had Willow and Welsie, who are both from a rescue. Welsie only made it to 2. Willow made it to 2 years and 2 months old. And I have these boys. I have no idea how long they're going to live. They're a little over a year old right now, and they're doing fine. But they are both from chain pet stores, probably Petco. So it's really hard to say how long I have with them because, genetically speaking, they are not going to be the strongest rats. So that's something to keep in mind when going through a rescue. However, my experience with rescue rats has been an overwhelmingly positive one. Mine have all been very sweet, kind, playful. They've been what you want in a rat. And that's not how everyone's experience is going to be. We are all of us just the sum of our experiences as rat owners. So some people have really bad experiences with rescue rats and some people have really good ones. And there's just a lot of false information about rescue rats, in my opinion. Because, like, you get a rescue rat and they become hormonally aggressive or they have behavioral problems or health issues. And people are just like, well, they're a rescue. But if you get that with a breeder rat, they don't say anything. They're just like, oh, it happens. Well, yeah, it happens in breeder rats. It happens in rescue rats. Breeder rats can become hormonally aggressive. They can have health issues. They can have all the same issues. They're just from a breeder. That's the thing. It's just typically a little bit more predictable with breeder rats based on their lineage. The other factors are people don't want to get rescue rats because they want the pretty varieties. Well, those varieties do end up in rescue. I've seen Dwarfs in rescue. I've seen Martins. I've seen all the shaded varieties. I've seen Silvermanes. I've seen cinnamons. I've seen all sorts of rats end up in rescue because backyard breeders get a hold of these varieties. They breed them, they sell them without any care of where they end up, and then they inevitably, what are you playing with? And then they inevitably end up in rescue. Another factor is a lot of people say, well, they want babies. So yeah, adult rats are more likely to end up in rescue. However, as I mentioned before, you're very likely to get missed-sex rats from pet stores. So when they inevitably have babies, a lot of people then turn to rescues for help. So you end up with a lot of oops litters. So most of my rescue rats have been babies. Ducky and Dorothy were 4 weeks old when I got them. Willow and Wolfie were 5 weeks old. These guys were 6 months old-ish, 6 to 8 months old. But yeah, you can get babies, you can get adults. Both are possible. I remember a week after I got Ducky and Dorothy, I put up this picture of Ducky, and someone's response was, "That's it, I'm going to a breeder next time." And I was just like, actually, she's from a rescue. Because she's adorable. Obviously, she is a gorgeous rat. She gets so much attention. She is just a rescue, though. You can get adorable rats from reputable rescues. So yeah, that's what I probably advocate for the most for new owners because of how complicated breeders are in the US. So let's get to that. So the thing with breeders in the US, they're very different from breeders in the UK or even Canada. So what the UK considers a reputable breeder does not really match up with US breeders for the most part. You can find them. They're not easy to find by any means, but you can find them. You just have to ask a lot of questions. So one of the biggest things with breeders in the US and why they're complicated is because they do something called culling, or hard culling if you prefer. And that's where they will unalive a rat because they do it for very many reasons, honestly. The most common thing you'll hear them talk about with culling is that they do it because they don't want anyone to get bit. They claim that it's for the safety of the people they are adopting out to. And they'll do this for hormonal aggression or aggression of any kind. Without even trying spaying and neutering or placing them in different groups or anything like that, they'll just cull. And that's the most commonly talked about reason for culling. And I understand some of you are like, well, that makes sense, even though it doesn't really make sense because they're deliberately breeding these rats. And therefore they're taking on the responsibility of trying to, give them a good life. But it's easier to cull, so they cull. And the thing is, that's the most talked about reason, and they have all these justifications for it. But if you get into breeder groups, or if you talk to reputable breeders, or anything like that, you quickly learn that breeders will cull because the rats aren't the right color, or because the mom had too many, or because they don't have space for their adults anymore. They'll cull if the rat is too wiggly when they are a tiny baby, as in their eyes aren't even open yet. I have seen breeders who will cull because they're wiggly as teeny tiny beans. They'll cull because they didn't sell. They'll cull for all sorts of reasons. They'll cull if they squeak when they're picked up, if they, again, squirm too much, if they don't like being handled. A lot of US breeders do this thing where they don't handle the baby rats at all because there's this theory that if they're bred properly, you cannot touch them at all, but when you do eventually pick them up, they'll be perfectly fine. Which sounds insane. It sounds like bullshit. Do that with a kitten and see if they like you. They're not gonna like you. Do it with a rat and they're supposed to like you. It makes no sense. And that's my biggest issue with American breeders, is because a lot of them do this. Not all of them by any means, but a lot of them, and they're typically very proud of it. So if you ask, they will just be honest with you. But you have to make sure to ask if it's for something other than health reasons, because a good breeder will also euthanize a rat if they are extremely unhealthy, failing to thrive, that sort of thing, just to end their suffering. It's one of those things that gets to me because I disagree with it so strongly. There was this breeder who's complaining about rats she got from a different breeder, and how one of the males she got was immediately extremely hormonally aggressive, so she had to cull him the second he got to her. And she's like, did you give him time to calm down? Did you give him time to adjust to his new environment? I know you didn't try to neuter him. You just decided he wasn't worth saving. And it drives me up the wall because they claim that they care about rats, but they don't. They care about what's most convenient for them, what's easiest for them. At the end of the day, that's what it is. It's what's easiest for them. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So American breeders will also oftentimes neuter rats in their house, basically, and they do it in very cruel, painful ways to rats. You ask anyone who understands rats at all, and they will tell you it's an awful way to treat a pet rat. They often keep them in small enclosures with very little enrichment. They don't put a lot of effort into their food. They don't try very hard with anything. They'll claim that their rats are perfect. They never get anything like tumors or hormonal aggression or any of these things, which is obviously not true. And that's why I usually advocate for rescues for first-time rat owners until they learn more about breeders and know what to ask for. They'll often get bad advice. They basically do anything they can to stay out of a veterinary office. It's frustrating. It's very frustrating. And until you decide what you are looking for in a breeder and know what questions to ask, it's just a safer bet to go get a rescue rat or a rehomed rat, because morally speaking, you're in the clear. Now, again, I'm going to emphasize this. Not all breeders are like this. There are plenty of breeders that do not follow these practices, that do not cull willy-nilly, that would really prefer their rats to go to good homes and have good lives, even if that means having to spay or neuter or what have you. So, Orville is chewing on her Loveledge. Okay. Anyway, that was a long ranty video. My cat's freaking out next to me. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, you know what to do. All the fun stuff down below. And I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye!